Welcome to Books and Authors. I'm your host, Chris O'Donnell. I have two very special guests with me today, Brian Hicks and Schuyler Kropf, authors of Raising the Hunley, The Remarkable History and Recovery of the Lost Confederate Submarine. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Appreciate you being here.
Sure.
I'd like to start with a little bit of background on you guys. You both live in Charleston presently,
Yep.
and you work for the Charleston Post-Courier, for the newspaper. Are you guys both from Charleston originally?
No, I'm from East Tennessee,
Okay.
around Chattanooga.
I grew up in Alexandria, Virginia, outside of Washington.
And what brought you guys to Charleston?
Work, yeah, just the paper.
Yeah, started in journalism career, just followed it down in Charleston.
Now, were you both, as far as your education background, both in journalism, and that's what you studied?
Yeah, I went to West Virginia University.
Mm-hmm.
I went to University of Tennessee in Chattanooga.
Great. Now, as far as the interest in the Hunley, how did that start? Are you guys both historians by nature, and where did the interest really start to come about?
I grew up as a Civil War freak in Fairfax County, which is where the war really started, in Manassas and that sort of thing. So I was always exposed to it as just growing up.
Now, as growing up in that area where it's just seeped in Civil War history, were you always immersed in
Robert
that?
E. Lee's boyhood home is in Alexandria, and Alexandria played a pivotal role in the Civil War. So I actually seen pictures of the Hunley in history books growing up.
And Brian, yourself?
Yeah, I'd always been interested in the war. Actually lived on Missionary Ridge on the battlefield, and just before I moved to Charleston, there was still a cannon in the front yard of the guy across the street from me, pointed at my front door. So you couldn't really forget about it.
Not so easily. Now, with your media background, you guys both work for the paper. Was that a help as far as doing the research and uncovering things that maybe the general public would not have access to?
Yeah, we wouldn't have been able to do the book if we hadn't had the access that we had as journalists to the Hunley, at least for the modern stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as the historical research goes, if we hadn't been reporters, we probably wouldn't have known how to find that stuff.
We were also front and center. We were the link to the world, basically, on the story, especially during the recovery and the discovery and that sort of thing, too. And we got emails from all over the planet from people interested, and so we were the first line.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there was obviously worldwide attention on the fact of the raising and the discovery of it. Let's start a little bit with the background of the whole period of the Hunley during the Civil War. Operation Anaconda refers to the blockade of the southern ports, basically from Virginia all the way to Texas. Explain a little bit about the Union blockade and what they were trying to achieve during the war.
Well, basically, they thought they could choke off the South and get started there. If they could cut off the South to South America and to Europe and just no pipeline there, they could basically starve the South back into the Union. And that was the whole idea of doing it by the sea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And obviously the South was still trading with Europe, with South America at that time. So that was, they had open access to goods.
Yeah, and that's where Hunley came into it. Horace Hunley was a planter from New Orleans who, even before he envisioned creating the submarine, would try to run the blockade by getting weapons and arms and money and goods in from Cuba, would stop over from Europe.
What was one of the most, actually the most important port in the South at that point?
New Orleans and Charleston were really both of similar importance. New Orleans was a bigger city, but I think Charleston may have been a more important port.
Mm-hmm. Now, with Charleston, was there also a view from the Union that port was important because the rebellion started there, and that was the beginning, and the feelings toward Charleston?
Yeah, it was kind of a symbolic thing. They really wanted Charleston. Lincoln wanted Charleston. The first shots were fired there, and that's where secession was born. And so, yeah, that was a main target.
Now, was Charleston then blockaded by some of the best ships of the Union at the time?
Well, if you say best ships, there really weren't a lot of good ships in the Union Navy at the time, but what they had, they sent there. They successfully choked off Wilmington. New Orleans actually fell very early in the war, so that left Mobile and Charleston as really the main outlets for the South.
Mm-hmm. And it's surprising when I was going through the book that most people think about ironclads and they'll think about the Monitor and the Virginia, or in the Union version, the Merrimack. And actually there were ironclads all over the the ports and the river system during the Civil War.
Well, what was unique about the Southern ironclads is they were not made to go to sea. They were made as defensive weapons, and you saw that in Charleston. They were built there in Charleston to mainly guard the harbor. They weren't for the ocean. They were for just a defensive weapon purely.
Now, with the Union blockade, when it started, obviously it got off to a good start. It was growing as far as in its nature. Did the South anticipate that something needed to be done, or disaster was imminent?
They really were overmatched from the beginning, because when the Confederate government started, it didn't have a Navy. You know, the U.S. Navy retained all of its ships when the country broke apart, and that's where the privateers came in. They were basically hiring private ships to go out and try to break the blockade and keep the harbors open.
Now let's segue into that as far as the privateers. The South really didn't have much of a Navy at the time. It was basically a U.S. Navy, and this privateer system came into being. Explain exactly what that was.
Actually, it goes back to the War of 1812, and even before that, it was not uncommon for cities, groups of businessmen to get together to fund warships to protect the fleet. And they had the money. There was not a big taxing system then either, so it was done that way, where these groups would build many private fleets.
Now, is that also, it seems like that's a fine line between pirates and actual Navy. Is there actually a similarity between?
Well, that's a very good point. I mean, one person's pirate is
another person's privateer.
or
Yeah.
even patriot.
Yes.
So.
Yes, interesting. Now, as far as the blockade was concerned, how long could the South hold out with the blockade? I mean, it's looked at as though they held out as long as they could, but if they didn't do something quickly, was there a timeline they were looking at, or?
You know, supplies were running low, money was running low, and the blockade only got better as it went along, and a lot of the privateers actually just had to give up. It just wasn't working out for them. In fact, one of the guys who was on the final crew of the Hunley was a privateer who had given it up because it was just too difficult.
Now, with the successful attempts to run the blockade, I know there are a lot of stories, you know, about the Southern ships trying to get in and out of the blockade. Was there some success on the South's part? And this is aside from the Hunley, was there success with running the blockades?
Yeah, it was considered a very risky and almost romantic kind of. As you know, Rhett Butler became probably the most famous fictional blockade runner there
yes.
was. But they would go to all sorts of extremes. They would sometimes paint their ships sand-colored so that it could run the blockade almost camouflage too. So it was done as often as it could.
Now, the European nations, how did they view the blockade running, and how did they view the Southern ships getting out of the blockade and coming into port to purchase goods? Was there a view that, hey, this is great if they can make it, or was there some loyalty to the Union at that point?
Well, England, for example, was going back and forth on to support the South or not, and there were Confederate warships that were built at, say, the Liverpool docks too. So I think they turned a blind eye to what was going on just to see how fast the South would be able to exist, and so it was kind of a neutral kind of thing where they allowed it to go on.
Okay.
They were friendly enough with the Confederacy that it strained relations with Great Britain for years after the war.
And how did that, as far as Britain was concerned? I know France also, with the Southern ships coming in and purchasing goods, and even with paying the privateers. How did the Confederate dollar come into play with that, or was it just really accepted as far as was gold the accepted means of payment for goods?
I don't know what they used to pay.
I don't know, there's probably a lot of credits involved too, because I mean, cotton was the currency.
Yes.
They probably got stuck for a few bills after the war.
I would think there's some unpaid bills, absolutely. Yeah. Now let me segue also into Horace Hunley and his partner McClintock. These actually were two guys that started as privateers, I guess you could say, with their visions. How did they come up with the vision of in that day they called it a fish boat, but a boat that could actually go underwater, dive, come back up, the submarine that we would call it today?
Well, there had been attempts to build submarines before. Even Robert Fulton's steamboat, the guy who invented the steamboat, had tried to do that. But shortly after the start of the war, the idea had been circulating. There was a letter to the editor printed in a Tennessee newspaper that said we have to build these submarine boats, these fish boats, to go under the water and attack the ships. And that's likely where Hunley picked up the idea. And
Okay, well, we want to pick it up right there, but we got to break away real quick for these messages. We'll be right back. Welcome back. My guests are Brian Hicks and Schuyler Kropf, and we're talking about the Hunley. Let's go back, gentlemen, to the development and Hunley's vision of this fish boat, if you will. It was a very technologically advanced concept that Hunley and McClintock came up with. Let's again talk a little bit about that.
well, they had just really vague notions of an idea of what this thing should do, and Hunley was more the idea guy. He was the blockade runner. He was the guy who was more into the war. James McClintock was really just an engineer, and he was making bullets for the Confederate Army. He had a machine shop, and Hunley approached him about this, and they built their first submarine. Was 34 feet long, and it didn't even have ballast tanks, which the Hunley would later have. But basically, this guy, James McClintock, is kind of the unheralded inventor of the modern submarine. He invented dive planes, conning towers, ballast tanks, all of the elements you see on the modern submarine. They just came up with it ahead of their time.
Now, they experimented in Mobile, which is where I understand that the prototypes were developed, and with some success, but in many ways limited success. Why did they push on? What was the incentive for these guys to really come up with the real deal, if you will?
Well, your first submarine got your second submarine, which got your third. So it was really just a quick evolution in technology.
Now, it's known that there were other experiments that I believe McClintock and other gentlemen that were part of this project were working on, one being the Gatling gun. Was it looked at as the South? Did the South look at this situation as the war was dragging on, or as the war was starting to go into its middle phases, that there was some sort of a desperation for some miracle weapons? As I was reading the book, it was somewhat reminiscent of Germany, say in about 44 or so, looking for that real miracle cure to turn things around. Was the South in that same position?
It's probably a similar parallel. I mean, as a desperation, you saw Germany launch V-1 terror weapons to try to break whatever blockade there was that was coming at them. It was the same thing with the Hunley. No one knew what they had, would it work, what its effect would be. So mainly everyone was so geared towards land battles and land fighting and trying to win that way. No one really thought that a tiny 4-foot contraption would really, 40-foot contraption would be so devastating.
Yes. Now, as they were developing it and getting that final prototype, which was the Hunley, what were the biggest obstacles they had to overcome?
Well, they lost their first submarine in New Orleans because as they were testing it, the Union invaded, took the city. So they had to sink it to hide it. They didn't want the Union to know about it. In Mobile, they were just kind of learning to do it when they built their second one, and they lost it in a storm. So they really had the advantage of going through this evolutionary creation of the submarine. By the time they built the Hunley, they'd had a year and a half of trial and error, and whereas the Pioneer, their first one, didn't even have ballast tanks. This one was very technologically advanced.
Now, I know there was some talk. I think McClintock had looked at the possibility of actually putting in a powered engine, electromagnetic type of engine, and other, I guess, fixtures. Whatever happened with that idea?
It really, he had built an engine, but it really couldn't turn the propeller with enough power to do the sub any good, to move it. And he was convinced to just give that up and go back to hand cranks, which he'd put in the first two.
And that's how it was powered, was hand cranked. And I want to talk about the conditions on this submarine. 8-man crew, they're sealed in this iron tube, if you will. Very little ventilation. There's really no rear navigational system. Candlelight and hand cranked. What was it like for the crew as they were going through the training and whatnot with this submarine?
Musty, dark. They were probably all sweating profusely from, it was originally the first Nautilus machine, it was just a guaranteed workout. And they found by looking at the crew afterwards that there was just such wear and tear on their bones from, first of all, they came from ships, so they found injuries familiar with working on ships and ropes and that sort of thing too. It was probably just multiplied by being inside the sub.
Now I understand the sub was about 4 feet tall and a little over 3 feet wide.
42 inches.
And 42, and the hatches to get in were a little over 2.5 feet or so. That's a very tight squeeze for 8 men. They have to look for specially built individuals to man this?
Mostly you're dealing with people who are malnourished too, so that went into it also. And then basically humans were smaller then too, the diet was different. So and you and I probably would be very uncomfortable inside the sub right now.
Now, was the sub inherently dangerous? I know that General Beauregard felt very strongly about this sub being very dangerous. Is that true?
Well, it was a very delicate machine to operate. It was real easy to mess up and sink it. The first time it sank, it was either the wake of a passing ship or the captain stepped on the dive plane while it was just getting started and it went down. The second time it sank, Horace Hunley was at the control and he'd simply forgotten to close the valve to the ballast tank. So Beauregard made the famous statement that this thing's more dangerous to us than the Yanks. And while that was true in a way, it was only because people were operating it who didn't really have a good grasp of how it worked. In the right hands, it did fine.
And what should be pointed out was that it worked. It did what it was supposed to do. It went underwater, achieved negative buoyancy, and came back up again. So it was a working machine. And the reason why it was lost was human error.
Now, that's an interesting point when you chatted about Hunley. Hunley was actually lost in his own machine, and there was a crew before his crew that was lost. So you have 2 complete crews, albeit a few crew members did make it out of the second disaster. Yet they never really had a problem filling the ranks of the crew. They always had enough volunteers. Why is that? I like to think of them as kind of 19th century astronauts. Here are these guys who were kind of daredevils. I think they saw it as cutting edge technology and they wanted to be the guys that proved it would work. Plus they were looking at some pretty good money if they actually sank a ship. I mean, let's talk about that.
Well,
that's an incentive.
Back to the role of being a privateer. There would be shares involved. Whatever they sank, they would get a cut of that money. So you're talking about people that basically are poor sailors, not known for a lot of money, not coming from money, trying to get rich too. So it was a mix of money and patriotism that drove them to it.
And I understand that it was actually based on the number of ships that the Hunley could actually take down of the Union blockade fleet.
They had price tags on different ships, like the new Ironsides, which was supposed to be the biggest, most technologically advanced Union ship, was worth $100,000 to the Confederate government, which is like the equivalent of $2 or $3 million now. And those guys would have split that with the owners.
Now let's talk also a little bit about why Charleston, as far as the Hunley. Were there any other ports that were considered as far as launching the Hunley and having it try to break the blockade?
Well, it's after they fled New Orleans, they went to Mobile, which was still an open working port, but the city was so far from the ocean that it didn't make much sense there, and it was a rough ocean down there too. It just made more sense to send it to Charleston to try to break it there, because the blockading fleet was much closer to shore there as opposed to what was going on in the Barrier Islands off Mobile.
And again, I would imagine in their training, one of the biggest obstacles had to be fatigue of the crew. And looking at the Union blockade, it was a few miles out into the ocean from Charleston Harbor. Was that something that was the real obstacle for them? I would think that would have to be.
They tried towing it a little bit because they were stationed in the harbor at first, and that didn't really work out real well, so they moved it to Sullivan's Island, where you're right there on the ocean, and that made it a little bit better.
Now let's talk about the mission itself, which was February 17th, 1864, and that was the night that they were going to go after their first Union ship. What was with the crew at that point? You know, losing 2 complete crews prior to this mission. What must have been going through these guys' minds on that particular night, and how do you think they overcame those feelings of fear?
I think by the time they got to that, this final crew had been on the submarine almost every other day for 2 months. I think they were comfortable with it. It was a very calm ocean. They were probably as confident as they could be with this new technology. It It was a cold night. They were a little nervous because there was about a half moon. It was not real dark out there, but the water was calm. And they were being ordered by Beauregard. He, not really understanding the technology, told them not to dive in the submarine. He said that he thought that that was why it sank, that it would go down and it just wouldn't come back up. But they, you know, placated him, but they were still diving, and on the night they went out to sink the Housatonic, they went down and came back up as far as we know. They did attack on the surface, but I think they were probably fairly confident. They'd been training for it. They'd been waiting.
And Beauregard obviously was somewhat justified in his fears of what might happen, but things actually went in some ways quite well. But we're going to jump into that in just a moment. We're going to break for these messages. We'll be right back. Welcome back. My guests are Brian Hicks and Schuyler Kropf. We're talking about the Hunley. Gentlemen, let's talk about Hunley's going out its first mission, the weapon system that this boat used. It's called a spar. Explain exactly what that is.
Well, the first attack method was they had almost a floating keg of powder, and it was a contact mine, and it was to be drugged behind the Hunley, not unlike a water skier like you would today, and it was designed to go underneath the ship, and as it was towed, the explosive would hit the back of the ship and explode while the Hunley came out the other side. During a trial run one night, there was seen that came floating back toward the Hunley, and there was a hazard involved with that. And Beauregard was an engineer by education, and he got the idea to mount it on a spar pole roughly 22 feet long on front of the sub, and that way it would attack and sting and ram this explosive into the side of its victim and make it stick there. The sub would back off, leave the explosion there, and an explosive line would go tight and trigger the explosion and set it off. It would be like a bee leaving a stinger, backing off again.
So actually was a trigger system, like a lanyard type.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting. Now, as they were going out into the sea, did they actually have the Housatonic pegged as a ship they were going to go after? Was it more of a target-rich environment, and that happened to be the best target at the time?
Well, imagine across a 4 mile of ocean, because that's how long the distance between land and where the blockade was, and this was the last ship on the blockade.
Mm-hmm.
They could see it at night, they could see lights. You really couldn't see it that well in the daytime because it was such a far expanse, so they knew it was out there, and at night they would leave lights on, and there was action on the ship, and you probably could hear voices across that distance. And it was the closest too, and so that's why they picked that one.
Now, I know they probably were relying on surprise and sort of the deceptive method that the boat was to incorporate. It was a pretty calm night. Did they get that surprise that they were looking for?
Not as much as they wanted. There had been some guys who had escaped, some defectors, who had basically told Dahlgren, the leader of the blockade, about this. And they'd had orders to anchor in shallow water to be looking for this, and they kind of understood the concept because the Union was working on its own submarines. And so they'd been told, anchor in shallow water and keep an eye out for this thing. And actually, one of the sailors on bow watch spotted the Hunley when it was about 200 yards out and told his superior officer, who ignored him and paid no attention to him. And luckily somebody else, the officer who was in charge at the time, spotted the Hunley. But by the time they saw it, it was too close to train the cannons on it.
And they successfully sank it.
Yes.
Now, after they sank the Housatonic, the Union actually feared that there were more boats like this coming at them. They had no idea what had happened to the Hunley. And did that do much to lessen the blockade, just the rampant rumors that maybe there was a fleet of these submarines that...
Well, Dahlgren had warned that chains be thrown on the side of their ships and to be on the lookout for such a thing. That was his biggest fear, that there were going to be more than one of these Hunleys out there.
Now, did the South actually look at capitalizing on these rumors?
Actually, they didn't even know what they had done. They'd captured, I think it was just another ship, a small little boat, and that's when they find out exactly what had happened. They really had no clear concept of how successful they were because there were no survivors to tell the story.
And then the Hunley was lost. Now, I understand that the Union had no idea what had really happened to the Hunley until actually the South. They mentioned to the South that, or the Southerners, some sailors that were captured, that this ship had gone down, and that was sort of how the whole thing unraveled. Very interesting with the communications, or say lack of communications, and that the Southerners couldn't really capitalize on this.
They didn't even know that the Hunley was lost for a couple of days. The sub was reported back. There was never, it was a day and a half later before anybody even reported that the sub was missing. And they, of course, didn't put anything in the newspaper saying we've lost our sub, not for a while. So there were a lot of rumors, a lot of people who, even though this was a secret weapon, they knew about it around Charleston. And there were all these, rampant rumors about what had really happened to the Hunley.
And with the Housatonic, they lost, from what I understand, about 5 sailors. Hunley loses its entire crew for the 3rd time. If the South had had a fleet of these, could it have made much of a difference with these somewhat staggering losses?
Probably psychologically it could have for a while, but it needs to attack. It needs to be stealthy. It probably would have been seen at some point, and they would have found a way to combat them.
Now, this was the first submarine to sink an enemy vessel in combat. It would not be duplicated again until 1915 by German U-boats. Yet this is really a footnote in Civil War history. Why is that?
I don't think at the time they looked for these first that we do now, and I don't think they recognized it as this great technological advance. I mean, they didn't know that submarines would develop into these great machines. They'd just seen it kind of as an experiment that had mixed results as best. And the early historians, the early Civil War historians, really made very little of the naval side of things. They were mostly focused on the land battles, which were more important.
Do you think it had anything to do with the fact that it was actually a Southern victory in many ways?
That's an interesting point, but I think also the fact that it was just a one-time event and you just never saw it repeated again.
Now, after the Hunley went down, and years after the Civil War, when did the mystique about this boat start to develop as far as the time factors?
Well, when people started building the first submarines for the U.S. Navy in the 1890s, that kind of race was on to see who would build the first submarine. People got a little bit interested in the Hunley, and William Alexander, who had been one of the engineers on the project and the first officer until 2 weeks before the sub sank, he was really the only survivor close to this project, and he was getting letters from people who were interested and asking him things about it. And finally, around 1902, he wrote this huge newspaper article giving the entire history of the Hunley, and that was really when things started building up around it. It became a fairly popular story, and you'll see in the magazines of Confederate veterans where they would write reminiscences of the war, there were a lot of them writing about, I saw the fish boat one time, or I was on the docks when it went out one time.
Now this gentleman also, Alexander, he was really the first one to draw some pretty accurate sketches, if you will, of the boat because he was on it. Why did it take until 1902, he was very, very elderly at that point, to really come out with this type of information? Was it the fact that the country wanted to heal after the Civil War, or was it something that just jogged his memory?
I think he just was busy with other things. He'd gotten on with his life, and they didn't really see it as that important a thing. But I guess after Reconstruction died down, the kind of the mystery of it, well, whatever happened to that, kind of came into play, and the legend of it grew. I mean, it was one of those Southern victories, so a lot of people in the South, would cling to it as.
And he actually knew the captain of the Hunley's final crew, which was Dixon, I believe, and perhaps helped dispel some of those rumors. And I understand that is one of the reasons that the boat was so successful with this mission, was the fact that Dixon was the captain.
There was an instantly lost friendship too.
And Dixon was the guy who basically raised the final crew. He evidently instilled a lot of confidence. I mean, he convinced Beauregard to change his mind about the Hunley, which was, I think that says it all about the guy. But he was a born leader, and he made the sub work. He made good on his promise.
And he did all this at the age of 26.
Yeah, the crew is so young, which is hard to believe that these guys at that age would be taking on such a monumental task.
Well, the youngest, they looked at some bones of one of the first crew, and he was 13, they believe. So.
Very, very young. Let's go into the expeditions and the final, the finding and discovery of the boat. There were a number of expeditions that were conducted. However, one name comes up, which is Clive Cussler, and his efforts into finding the boat. Where does his obsession come from with the Hunley and his involvement? And
it starts as a child when he saw the Chapman painting that is so prevalent. It's really the only existing picture we have of the Hunley during wartime, and that kind of just stayed in his mind throughout his life. And he went on and became a millionaire author, and really allowed him to go off on his hobby and go find the Hunley.
Now, is he really, or is he really an historian? And I know some people that he had some feuds going on that accused him of being really an egomaniac, if you will, of finding these wrecks and whatnot. Was he also a historian as far as the Hunley was concerned?
I think it just jogged something in his mind. That and John Paul Jones's ship, the Bonhomme Richard, he just wanted to find those. He just thought that it was necessary to get those on record.
Why did it take so long to discover?
Well, he has a famous quote that the thing about shipwrecks is they're never where they're supposed to be, and I think that's one of the reasons why it was so hard trying to find the Hunley, because it wasn't where it was supposed to be.
All of the previous searches for the Hunley had began at the wreck of the Housatonic and worked their way towards shore, and the Hunley was farther offshore than the Housatonic. And
seems like it was just a case of looking in the wrong place.
Yes.
Well, we're going to pick it up there because that's a good place to start with the whole search and expedition, but we'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back. I'm chatting with Brian Hicks and Schuyler Kropf. Let's go back into the discovery of the boat. They finally found where it was, looking off to the far side of the Housatonic. When the successful expedition was launched with Cussler's help in Numa, there were a lot of political factions that wanted to jump in and take ownership of this prize. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, you had the state of Alabama wanted it because it was built and it was a product of Alabama, and then the state of South Carolina wanted it, and the federal government wanted a piece of it too. So there was a lot of tug of war over the submarine.
I understand you had state versus state, federal versus state, Cussler versus state.
Navy versus state, Smithsonian wanted a piece of it. I mean, so there was a lot going around, but there was one man that really settled the whole thing.
And what was the final conclusion on that?
Strom Thurmond. That's about all you need to say.
And it was decided that it was going to be a South Carolina.
Yes.
Prize,
the U.S. government owns it, but South Carolina has ownership, has possession of it in perpetuity.
Yeah, back on the Thurmond story is the Navy wanted to come in. The story goes that he wanted to come in and talk about some defense issues with the senior senator, and the senator came out of his office and basically said, "I've got to settle ownership of the Hunley. I don't have time for defense budgets," and that's where the Navy kind of gave up and ended up delivering it to South Carolina.
That's good spirit. Now, speaking of the spirit of the Hunley, it came at an interesting time in South Carolina, with the flag issue over the dome of the Capitol, and a lot of political correctness that was ensuing because of that matter. How did the spirit of raising a Confederate boat stay up to par, if you will?
It was a tough navigation for them, is because they tried to stay out of the flag controversy, which was so prevalent, but they do say they had a hard time raising money at that time because there was a lot of businesses that don't want to give donations to the project because they were afraid of the Confederate flag issue.
Now, when they finally started bringing it up, it was a fascinating project, obviously. Tell us a little bit about the technology and actually cradling this boat and raising it.
Well, we compare it to, if you've ever seen a rescue dolphin or whale where they put it in their rescue sling, that's basically what they did with the Hunley, is they ran slings underneath it and were able to lift it that way in a giant cradle.
Because I understand they really didn't want to jostle the interior as much, and I know there were some problems with bringing up other wrecks earlier. One wreck, I think, was the Cairo, which actually broke apart, which was years prior. What were the challenges in bringing up the Hunley as far as that's concerned?
Well, they didn't know how fragile it was. They didn't know how much it weighed, and the scientists were insistent that it be brought up. It was kind of listing to starboard a little bit, and the scientists wanted it to come up in that exact position because they were afraid if they pushed the sub upright to lift it, that it would shift artifacts inside. And when you're doing this kind of archaeological dig, the placement of artifacts tells you as much as the artifacts themselves. As it turns out, that wasn't really a concern, but they didn't know that.
Now, when they finally brought it up and started looking at it, I think the first surprise was how technologically advanced it was in comparison with a lot of the pictures or the ideas of the Hunley being somewhat bulky and boxy. This was much sleeker, hydrodynamic, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the biggest surprises as far as the technology is concerned with the Hunley?
I think they were a little surprised at how sleek it was. It's funny, the scientist had always kind of been critical of Chapman's painting, which is on the cover of the book, and said that's a little fanciful, that's just his artistic rendering, there's no way the Hunley's really like that. But when they uncovered it, they found that this bow knifes to a point, it's about this wide. The water would just go around it. It had flush-mounted rivets. Everything about this thing just screamed hydrodynamics.
Mm-hmm.
And also the old stories were that it was built out of a boiler, and that's just not the case. It was built from the ground up as a submarine. It may have used some boiler plates, but this thing was actually constructed as a submarine.
When they started doing the research on it, have they come up with a conclusion? I know there's a couple of ideas on why it was lost, why it sank.
There's two theories out there, and they're not sure yet. It's going to be a collection of finding out the strata around it, where the placement of the artifacts. They don't know for sure the condition of the bones of the crew. There are two things come. There's possibility that the men just played possum, waiting after the attack for the activity above on the surface and to dissipate, and they just ran out of air and just passed out underneath.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a chance it might have been hit by one of the ships coming to rescue the crewmen of the Housatonic.
Mm-hmm. I understand that actually the inside of the sub there is proof that it stayed dry for a number of years.
Yeah, the first thing they found in there were stalactites hanging off the ceiling, and those don't form underwater. Also, the men were found sitting at their exact position on the cranks,
Mm-hmm.
and if the sub had filled with water that night or any time shortly thereafter, the bodies would have all floated to the highest spot in the sub, and we would have found a jumble of bones. But instead, you found these guys just slumped over in their seats.
Let's talk about the crew a little bit, perhaps out of morbid curiosity of maritime disasters. What exactly was found as far as the crew is concerned?
They found their complete skeletons. They found just about every bone from every crewman, and the ones they don't have are probably still stuck to the hull somehow. They found a few traces of hair. The most interesting thing is, though, that the crewmen all had their brains are still in their skulls. A little shrunken, but they're still there, and still what you would expect a brain to look like.
Now, I understand that the remains of the crew were buried in Charleston with the remains of the first two crew?
The first two crews are all together. The first crew was actually found underneath the Citadel football stadium. They were just covered over there, just like in the movie Poltergeist.
Wow.
The headstones were moved, but not the bodies. And the first two crews are in with Horace Hunley in Magnolia Cemetery, and this third crew they're still looking at that, and probably will be burying them sometime in the fall of 2003.
What were some of the more interesting artifacts found on the boat, as far as just things that would really be fascinating for people who are studying the Civil War?
Probably the most fascinating artifact was George Dixon's gold coin. And this was a legend surrounding him that no one really knew if it was true. But the story was that Dixon was at the Battle of Schuyler in Tennessee in 1862, and that he was shot early in the fighting, but the bullet was deflected by a gold coin that he kept in his pocket that his sweetheart had given him. And nobody knew if that was true, but the scientists found the gold coin actually on the last night of the excavation in his pocket. It was bent from where a bullet had hit it, and he had had it engraved with the word Schuyler, April 6, 1862, my life preserver.
So there was somewhat of a love story attached with the Hunley also. Interesting. Now we talk about the industrialized North, the agrarian South at the time of the Civil War. Obviously, experimenting with such a technologically advanced weapon was unusual. If something like this had worked, and whether it had changed the course of the war, do you see something like this as actually changing the South from its agrarian roots to more of an industrialized area?
Well, I think the Hunley worked because it was Charleston. It would not work in the open sea. It could only work where there was a harbor. The unique thing about this is you had a defensive, offensive weapon where you had the South up against the wall. They had to strike back. This is what they could use. They didn't have a fleet. They couldn't match the surface ship of the Union one-on-one. They had to go underwater. It was just ingenuity.
Mm-hmm. Now with the Hunley that they found, if it had been successful and had come back and had spawned more Hunleys, could this have actually hastened the development of the submarine? Perhaps we could have seen the submarine come into play in, say, the 1870s, 1880s?
Probably not, because it was more of the diesel engine that made submarines work, the gasoline engine that made it work. You just didn't have the manpower. The submarines could not go across great distances like they could today, or even during World War I and World War II. It had to be close to shore. It could only, you couldn't take the fight to someone else.
Now, I also understand of late that the Hunley's crew has supplied a lot of information about bioterrorism and things of that nature, as far as watching bodies, how they are exposed to different radiation, and I found that somewhat interesting. So it's really helping into the future, if you will.
Yeah, that's one of the things that the scientists are most happy about, is that a lot of people say, well, what public money goes into this? They say, what's the use of this? What good is this other than just satisfy our curiosity? And this is one of the benefits, is that some of the imaging they did to find out what was inside the Hunley before they opened it, they've used at ground zero.
Now, does Clive Cussler have any projects on the horizon as far as raising any more Civil War ships or anything?
Kind of one of those stay tuned kinds of things. The Hunley's predecessor is somewhere in Mobile Harbor, and he's got a group looking for that, so you might hear something that soon.
Interesting. Now, they they raised the turn of the Monitor recently. How did that affect you guys, and did it bring back memories of the Hunley?
Well, we were lucky, because we went up to Norfolk and saw where pieces of the Monitor were, and the preservation going on there. It looks like we saw the propeller, and it looks like it was made yesterday. So when they're done with the Hunley, which they're doing the same thing too, it will look very pristine.
Wow, interesting. It's a fascinating subject, and you guys have done a great job in the book, and really have covered it quite well. And the book is Raising the Hunley, and it is available at Barnes & Noble. And as we have said, it's going to make a great Christmas gift for plenty of historians out there. But I want to thank you guys for coming by and sharing all this with us. It's tremendously fascinating. It's a great topic to chat about. And I also want to remind our viewers of the books and authors, actually author luncheon, on Friday the 27th at the Marriott Beach and Oceanfront Resort here on Hilton Head. And the guest is going to be Lowcountry author Pat Conroy for that particular luncheon, and all information on tickets can be found by calling the Marriott here on Hilton Head. For Books and Authors, I'm Chris O'Donnell. Thanks for joining us.